Hello everybody and welcome to our Valuing Nature Natural Capital webinar. This is the final one of this series of 5. My name is Anita Weatherby. I'm the Valuing Nature Project Manager for our Programme Coordination team, and I'm joined today by Victoria Barlow, who's a colleague of mine at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and we'll be running this webinar today. We're delighted today to be able to introduce Rose Pritchard, who's based at the University of Sheffield. She's going to tell us about the report on monetary natural capital assessment in the private sector, which she actually worked on while she was based at the University of Edinburgh. So what we'll do today is that I'll give you a very brief introduction to the Valuing Nature programme. Apologies for people who have tuned in for all these webinars and have heard this before. I'll go through that quite quickly. Then I'll hand over to Rose, who will speak for a little while about her report. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So can I please encourage you to type in your questions as we go along. You should see that you've got a questions box there, which you can put the questions into. So the Valuing Nature programme, for those who aren't familiar, this is a 5-year investment from 4 research councils and DEFRA. The idea was recognising that in terms of thinking about how we think about the natural environment and the values that we use in making decisions about the natural environment requires research from across a number of different disciplines. We need more than just knowledge about the natural environment itself. We need to think about how human beings make decisions in terms of economic, in terms of social issues, in terms of arts and humanities values, things like history and culture that we bring together, and in terms of the biological systems going on behind there. This programme then, the aim was to better understand and represent the complexities of the natural environment in valuation analyses, taking into account the wider societal and cultural values of ecosystem services. And the funders recognised that there was value in building a community of expertise across the UK, in working across the different discipline areas and working in actually applied context with end users. And to that end, DEFRA was one of the funders of this work as well. The goals under the programme there are to build this network, to build this capability for the UK of working across these different interdisciplinary areas, bringing together researchers with businesses, with policymakers and with practitioners. And with that in mind, the funders funded a programme coordination team. That's the role that I'm taking on here. And we've been running a series of activities over the last 4 years or so, and some of those are listed on there. We've held an annual conference. For example, we've run a placement scheme where we've been able to fund people to go and work in a different discipline area or a different applied context. We've had a series of business engagement activities, including a business impact school for early career researchers to come and hear from businesses how they really make decisions about the natural environment. And we've produced a set of demystifying publications which are available on our website and cover topics such as demystifying economics. What do you need to know coming in from a different discipline about how economics is applied in this context? As well as that goal to build this network of capability, there are 2 research goals, one of which is about human health and well-being, so increasing our understanding of the value of the UK's natural environment for human health, both physical and mental health, and for well-being. And there are 4 research projects funded in that area. And the final goal is on ecosystem stocks and tipping points. And this is about understanding the relationships between the ecosystem services, the ecosystem stocks, and the benefits that come to humankind from those, and defining those critical levels of ecosystem stocks so that we can work to avoid damaging change in the delivery benefits that we get from those stocks and services. If you haven't already signed up, please do go, excuse me, please do go to the website and sign up for the Valuing Nature Network. We've got about 2,000 people signed up as members at the moment, and that means that you'll get occasional emails about activities and opportunities to engage with this kind of work. So things like this webinar series and our annual conference coming up. There's also a whole load of news and activities on the website, and we have a very active Twitter account. So on to these natural capital synthesis reports. We recognise that natural capital is one of the major concepts in this area of valuing nature. It's on the agenda of a lot of government departments and agencies and of businesses thinking about how best to do this. And we recognised there was a bit of a gap between the understanding from the research side and what was needed to actually apply these concepts in the real world. So we ran a call for people to bid in to produce these reports. with the ambition of summarising the current state of knowledge for users in particular areas. The 5 reports that are available are now on our website, and we've had this series of webinars to share the contents of those reports. So these are the titles and the people who presented on those reports for our webinar series, and you can see we're now on the final one today, hearing from Rose about monetary natural capital assessment in the private sector. All of these reports are on the website. Please do go and download those if they're of interest to you. So I'll hand over to Rose in a moment, but just a reminder that we will have 15 minutes for questions after Rose has given her presentation. Please do type those questions in as we go along or at the end of the presentation. And can we just ask you to use simple language and spell out acronyms so we can be sure we've understood your questions correctly. Okay, thanks very much for that. I'll hand over to Rose now.
Okay, thank you very much, Anita, for the introduction there. Hello, everyone. As Anita said, today I'm going to be talking about natural capital assessments as used by the private sector. This is with some work done alongside Dan Vanderhorst at the University of Edinburgh. So just to give you an idea of the shape of the talk, we'll talk a little bit of background about natural capital and corporate natural capital assessment, assess the kind of current status of natural capital used by businesses. And we're also going to suggest a couple of areas for discussion where we think there might be scope for potential improvements in the way that the natural capital approach is used by business. So probably everyone here is aware of this already, but just to make 100% sure that we're all on the same page, by natural capital we refer to the stock of renewable and non-renewable natural resources that combine to produce benefits for people. So that's plants, animals, air, water, soils, everything that contributes to human well-being. And when we talk about natural capital valuation, we mean how we're expressing the value of these natural things. And often that is monetary valuation, but it doesn't have to be. There are other quantitative measures like carbon dioxide equivalents, or you could use qualitative measures for things which are less easily quantified, like the spiritual values of ecosystems, for example. And there's 2 logics given behind the use of economic approaches to the valuation of nature. One of them is that we're using these terms as metaphors. So often environmental costs are ignored in decision making. And if you can use language that is familiar to decision makers in your advocacy, then you might be able to express the value of the environment more clearly and make sure that it's included. And the other logic is that you can use natural capital approaches as the basis for decision making. So if you express the value of everything in the same units, and often in monetary units, you can then carry out cost-benefit analyses, and you can use that to find the least harmful pathway forwards. And this is a more controversial application for reasons that we're going to touch on a little bit later in this webinar. Okay, so we'll provide a very, very brief history of corporate approaches to natural capital assessment. So these kinds of economic approaches to valuing nature have increased exponentially in popularity since the 1990s. These ideas have been floating around since the 1970s. But in the 1990s, you had papers like the one by Costanza et al., who tried to value all the world's ecosystem services and natural capital. And while the methods of those early papers have come up for debate, the approach is very compelling, as you can see by the fact that it's now used in a lot of major international programs like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and things like the WAVES program, which is currently run by the World Bank and which is encouraging national governments to value their ecosystem services. So in some ways, business has come to this idea quite late. I'm pretty sure there was prior engagement with natural capital concepts by corporate actors, but often the first major engagement by corporate actors with economic approaches to valuing nature is described as being the publication of the first environmental profit and loss report, which was by Puma in 2011. And an environmental profit and loss report involves trying to value all of a business's impacts on the environment, both positive and negative, at all stages in the supply chain. So it's a huge undertaking. And a lot of other businesses tried to copy this approach, but the methods used and the way people were calculating these impacts were a bit haphazard. They were quite variable. And that obviously has costs in terms of the perceived legitimacy of the approach. And so to address this problem, in 2016, we saw the publication of the Natural Capital Protocol. And the Natural Capital Protocol was produced by a coalition of business, academia, research organizations, NGOs, consultancies, and the aim was to provide a standardized approach to natural capital assessment among businesses. And by standardized approach, we don't mean prescribing methods. The idea was to create a framework to guide businesses and to make sure that natural capital valuation was being done effectively. And the Natural Capital Protocol moves beyond an environmental profit and loss report because it also encourages businesses to value their dependencies upon natural capital, not just their impacts. And that means that businesses can identify natural capital risks and opportunities. So, for example, things like the potential for carbon costs to be internalized into businesses by taxation in the future, or potential things like carbon markets, which could be opportunities for businesses. And there are also claimed to be benefits for businesses in terms of reputational benefits and also wider benefits for society and for the environment. Now, the Natural Capital Protocol is a very interesting approach. It's a very interesting document, and we believe that it could increase the uptake of natural capital valuation by private sector actors. But so far, there is not very much critical literature on how economic approaches to the valuation of nature are being used by private sector actors. And by critical, we don't mean negative. We mean kind of balanced evaluations of these approaches and of the effects that they're having upon the environment and upon society. And so we thought that it would be very timely to evaluate what's been done so far, and also like to learn lessons from that in terms of shaping future practice. And so in order to do that, what we did was we compiled publicly available case studies of businesses who were early adopters of natural capital approaches. And we also include things like environmental profit and loss reports, because they're similar approaches. There are valuable lessons to be learned from these. And to find these businesses, what we did was looked at all the businesses affiliated with the Natural Capital Coalition, with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and also who were involved in the World Forum on Natural Capital in 2016. And we reviewed sustainability reports and websites, and looked for any evidence of engagement with natural capital concepts. We also looked at news items and case studies on the Natural Capital Coalition and on the World Business Council for Sustainable Development website. And that resulted in a set of 40 case studies of early adopting businesses. Now, there are some caveats that go with this data set. The first is that we did end up focusing upon businesses that use monetary valuation methods. The reason for this being that this was the most common approach that we encountered during our research. We were also restricted to those businesses who publicly shared information on their efforts to value natural capital. We know that there are other businesses who have made attempts to value natural capital but have not shared those results or those experiences in the public domain. So this isn't a full sample. And the third thing is that the case study material is quite variable, firstly in terms of the depth. So some organizations have published their whole methodologies, whereas in other cases we just have small segments of sustainability reports. And also in terms of authorship. So we have material written by the businesses themselves, by specialist consultancies, or by third parties. So we had to be very aware of authorship when we were interpreting these data. So this is still an interesting data set, particularly given that there isn't very much pre-existing research upon this topic, but we present our results with the caution that these caveats merit. And we suggest that you interpret these results in the same way. So what did we find? So the first thing was that we have some very notable skews in terms of who is currently doing natural capital assessment. So firstly, we found that the majority of early adopting businesses are situated either in the USA or in Western Europe. There's very little representation of businesses from the global south. And we also find a real skew towards businesses in the materials sector. There's also good representation of food and beverage businesses like Coca-Cola or apparel businesses like Hugo Boss. So some definite patterns in terms of which businesses are engaging with these kinds of approaches. And the early adopting businesses did encounter quite a lot of challenges when they were trying to apply these approaches. The first of these is data availability. So if you're attempting to value all your impacts and dependencies on your whole supply chain, then there's a need for an awful lot of data. And a lot of businesses ended up scaling down the scope of their assessments because of these data challenges. And in some cases, so businesses like Nespresso found themselves actually changing their data collection strategies based on their natural capital pilots because they found they simply didn't have the right kinds of data. There's also issues with the fact that the methods are pretty technical and monetary valuation methods are quite challenging. And so a lot of early adopting businesses had to adopt partnership working models. So they worked with specialist consultancies or with NGOs. Lack of internal buy-in was also a substantial challenge that businesses encountered. So there was emphasis on the need for internal engagement work and also for support from higher level management to facilitate these natural capital assessments. And the last thing was that these assessments do take quite a lot of time and an awful lot of resources. So Novo Nordisk were a very early adopter, and they said that to carry out their full environmental profit and loss report took between 12 and 18 months. And again, this is why a lot of businesses chose to opt for partnership working models and to seek support from consultancies when they were using these approaches. So the general message from the case studies was that these approaches are promising, they're potentially quite exciting, but that there is a need for external support for an awful lot of businesses. So those are the challenges as perceived by the businesses. We've now got some other discussion points, which are from the perspective of those of us working on sustainability and who are interested in new approaches for achieving improved corporate sustainability and kind of reducing corporate impacts upon the environment. And the first discussion point we'd like to raise actually links to an ongoing debate over economic approaches to the valuation of nature. And that's whose values and which values are actually captured by these approaches. And this is a criticism that has been particularly pointed at monetary valuation methods. And these are encouraged in the Natural Capital Protocol. But the concern is that an emphasis on monetary valuation does result in a skew towards those things which are easily monetized. And we do see this to an extent in our case study literature. So of the 33 businesses who shared enough methodological detail, pretty much all of them valued greenhouse gases, a lot valued water use, a lot valued pollution, very few valued impacts and dependencies upon biodiversity, and even fewer engaged with things like the spiritual or cultural values of natural capital, which are very important to an awful lot of people. So there is a risk that this can result in quite a reductive view of the natural world, quite a limited view of the natural world. And this links also to the question of how we can take into account less human-centric approaches to the value of nature. And here we quite often end up talking about intrinsic value. So intrinsic value is this idea that non-human life has value independent of any services it provides for humans. And the Natural Capital Protocol does say that these kinds of values may need to be taken into account because they're very important to business stakeholders. But it doesn't provide any information on how that can be done. And without clear guidelines, there is a real risk that other ways of looking at the natural world could be crowded out, that they could end up being inadvertently excluded because they're very difficult to include. And a further point was many of the early adopting businesses we looked at were large multinationals or transnational companies with very complicated supply chains, potentially impacting millions of stakeholders. But the stakeholder engagement strategies, as outlined in the Natural Capital Protocol, are skewed towards those who already have power. And this is an issue because negative environmental impacts of corporate activity are often concentrated on less powerful communities, on marginalized communities. So we would pose the question, can we take this start point, this interesting start point that we have with corporate engagement with natural capital valuation, and work from here to include a greater diversity of values, a greater diversity of environmentalisms, and a greater diversity of stakeholders? Is that something that we should be prioritizing? And that's something I would love to hear more viewpoints on. All of this is actually entirely irrelevant based on the answer to a second question. And that's, who is natural capital assessment actually supposed to benefit? Because if it's only supposed to produce benefits for the businesses carrying out the assessment, the whole of that previous slide is no longer relevant because those aren't pertinent issues. But the messaging around the Natural Capital Protocol and within the case studies makes claims for larger benefits. It's very much business benefits come first, and that's totally fine. But there are claims that there are also benefits for communities, environment, the broader economy, and the natural world. That's taken from the Natural Capital Coalition website. And for those of us interested in environmental sustainability, our support for this approach is contingent upon whether those benefits are actually occurring. And at the moment, the evidence for benefits beyond those which would have occurred anyway for environments and society is a bit thin. And the reason I say beyond those which would have occurred anyway is that many of the businesses who have engaged with natural capital have already engaged with other sustainability approaches like circular economy, life cycle assessment, corporate sustainability reporting. So there's a need to demonstrate these benefits for environment and for society. Now we're going to caveat this again. We're going to add another caution. This might be because a lot of businesses are still at the pilot stage. So it might be that benefits occur in the future, but we just haven't seen them yet. Or it might be because businesses are seeing benefits for society and for the environment, but those benefits aren't being shared in the public domain. But this lack of recording, or this lack of transparency, this lack of independent kind of auditing of the outcomes of natural capital assessments is a problem in terms of the amount of trust that there can be in those approaches. And given that the underlying ethos of natural capital approaches is that you can only manage what you're able to measure, the lack of measurement of outcomes does seem like quite a substantial problem in terms of understanding the impact that this approach can have. And this is particularly the case because we can see potential for the Natural Capital Protocol to be misused. Now, this is no shade at all on those who designed the Natural Capital Protocol. The intentions behind it are really, really good. But once a tool has been created, you have limited control over how that tool is subsequently used. And this links back to the point I made earlier about there being some controversy over the use of natural capital for decision making. Because when you apply a monetary value to something, there is an implication that maybe that thing is substitutable, that it can be replaced by another kind of natural capital or a technical alternative. And a lot of natural capital advocates are very much against substitutability. They believe that that's not morally justifiable. But in at least one of our case study businesses, the negative impacts that business had on the environment were characterized as being outweighed by their positive social benefits. So we saw a very clear trade-off situation. And that demonstrates that there is a potential risk of natural capital approaches being used to mask environmentally damaging behavior or even to justify it. And I know that's not the spirit within which the protocol was developed. So the question for discussion is, how do we safeguard against that? How do you safeguard against the natural capital concept being misapplied? And I don't have answers for that question. I would be very, very interested to hear the thoughts of those in the audience on that point. So that's what we covered in our report. I'm going to actually stop there. That's everything I had to say today. So thank you very, very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions or comments that you have.
Okay, thank you very much, Rose. This is Victoria Barlow here. I'm going to be asking Rose some of the questions that have been sent in. Okay, so first question is from Reinhard Weisinger. To what extent does monetary assessment of natural capital imply that the different capitals, in brackets natural, social, economic, are mutually replaceable?
So that was the point that we were raising at the end, and it's a very difficult one, because monetary valuation does, whether intended or not, I think it does suggest an element of substitutability, or that you can trade off different kinds of capital. And so the question is how you can design approaches in a way that safeguards against that happening. And this, I have no simple answer for that question, because it's a debate that's been ongoing since economic approaches were developed for valuing nature. And we are seeing that might be a risk of this approach.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Kali Ryu. What were motivations for the businesses to adopt natural capital assessments? How much did it cost for the businesses to conduct a natural capital assessment, and how long did it take? And another bit to that question, which is, did all 40 cases use the natural capital protocol? So quite a few questions within one question there.
Okay, remind me if I forget one of those.
Yeah,
I will
that's
do my
fine.
So in terms of the time taken, the only business that provided a clear time frame was Novo Nordisk, and they said between 12 and 18 months. But there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the scope of a natural capital assessment. So some businesses chose to look at just one product, some chose to look at just one part of the supply chain. So there were ways of scaling down and reducing the amount of time that was required, particularly as a lot of businesses are still in the pilot stage, which meant they wanted to test out this approach before rolling it out to a larger scale. I mean, this was similar with the Puma EP&L, where they focused initially on Puma and then scaled it up to the whole of the Kering group. In terms of cost, not many organisations have publicly disclosed that data, and so I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer for you there. In terms of motivations, there were a lot of different business motivations. A lot of businesses were interested in understanding risks and opportunities attached to natural capital. So a risk might be something like the potential for carbon costs or water costs to be internalised in the future due to taxation. A lot of them were interested in the kind of reputational benefits that you could gain from doing this kind of assessment. So that a lot were interested in the value of this as a communication tool. So equally between sustainability departments and other parts of the business, or between the business and external stakeholders. And some were using it for strategic decision making. So they have a budget to target towards sustainability activity, and they wanted to know where that resource should go. So it very much depended on the business in terms of which motivation was most important to people. And no, not all businesses used the natural capital protocol. So we included any business that had engaged with natural capital approaches or economic approaches to valuing nature since 2011 and the first Puma EP&L. So quite a few of the case studies are from before 2016. There are also quite a few that were pilot studies for the natural capital protocol. I think we're making a full list of all case study businesses and case study material available on the Valuing Nature Network website, but I will double check that so that you can actually refer to the original material yourself.
Okay, thank you, Rose. I think you answered all elements of that question, actually. So, well listened. So I have a question here from Siobhan Stewart. Given some of the concerns, would you see value in the development of a set of principles for applying natural capital approaches?
Yeah, I mean, if there were ways that you could develop a kind of list of safeguards or best practice guidelines or things like that, I think that could be very valuable. And then you can measure the approach that businesses have taken alongside those safeguards. I mean, a lot of that is within the Natural Capital Protocol already. But the things we flagged here were things that were not, from our perspective, adequately covered within the protocol already. But yeah, so an additional list of guidelines might be quite valuable.
Great, thank you. Okay, so my next question is from Peter Easton. You say transparency of methods and results is a problem. I would argue that every study should include supporting information to set out all assumptions and methods, and to invite challenges from anyone who might disagree. This will recognise this is work in progress and encourage debate. Is this transparency feasible?
I mean, there are businesses who have been extremely transparent in how they're applying these approaches. So the Caring Group, for example, have published their full methodology online. The Crown Estate, I think the ASP have also published their full methodology. So there are businesses which demonstrate that transparency is definitely possible. And those kind of businesses can be held up as an example of how this sort of thing could be done, to make sure that it's very clear what's being included, what's excluded. So yes, I definitely believe transparency is a possibility.
Great, thank you very much. And a question from Oscar Alvarado. Are there any third-party non-corporate organisations, i.e. NGOs, governments, undertaking natural capital assessments? This could be either for their own purposes or to compare / contrast with corporate assessments.
So we are a little outside my area of expertise there, I'm not going to lie, but yes, there are definitely governments who are using these kinds of approaches. I think the UK government had a natural capital committee who were working on similar themes, things like programs like the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity and the Current Waves programme are good examples of current kind of government-focused attempts. And also the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was a precursor to all of this work. So there are definitely non-corporate applications that you could use as a baseline.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have some comments, but not necessarily questions, from a few people that have taken part in this Q&A. But if there's no other questions, I think that we will pass on to Anita. Oh, somebody has said yes. I don't know if that's yes, they have a question, or yes, they were responding to a comment made on the question notice board. Okay. Great. Heather Webb has sent me one which says, great webinar. Do you have an idea about what external support some of the 40 case study businesses required?
So quite a few of them did engage with specialist consultancies like Truecost. So in some cases, pretty much the whole process was outsourced to an external agent. In other cases, so the Nespresso case study is interesting because I think that was instigated by an NGO, and they kind of guided the Nespresso through it. And that one's interesting because it focuses upon coffee farming in Colombia, so it's a very different context. Often the support is primarily to do with monetary valuation methods because they are extremely technical. And that's where you might need an external expert to be involved.
Great. Okay. Then I think that we will say thank you to everybody for listening in and taking part, and I'll hand over to Anita for the final words.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much, Rose, for that fascinating presentation and excellent questions there. Rose's email address is still up there on the slide, so please do contact Rose directly if you have any further questions. I can just confirm, as Rose said, that the case studies she mentioned, there is a document on our website with links through to the reports from those businesses. So all of the 40 different case studies there, you can actually go in and see some more details of what those businesses put in their own reports on natural capital. We've also had some questions about the videos. So we've been videoing all of these webinars, and those will be available on the website. Some are already available. We plan to get the last couple up there next week. And if you have signed up to the Valuing Nature Network, you'll get a notification email letting you know when those are all available. Okay, so it's just has left me to thank everybody. Thank you, Rose, for the presentation. Thank you, Victoria, for fielding those questions so well. Thank you, everybody, for asking questions and for attending our webinar series. That's goodbye from us. Goodbye.